Well, I'm very pleased to be here. I told Rod that I'm always glad to come, although I always get lost when I come. I can never find a place to park. And then, I mean, your campus is awesome, but it's sort of laid out like that maze in the Harry Potter movie, where sometimes I think even the hallways are moving. And as I was trying to find my way to lunch, I actually passed Taco Bell 3 times. And after a while, I realized it was probably the only Taco Bell on campus, and then I really was turned around. I'm very pleased that that Rod asked me to come and talk to you here today. He is an old friend and one of my most generous friends, as you can tell from that introduction. And I'm glad to be on the panel with Alexander, who was such a good student and does such important work on religious liberty. I do want to just depart from, just for a moment, from the theme because of something Alexander said. You know, the greatest compliment I think one can give to a teacher is that the teacher has caused the student to think more deeply and carefully about an issue, and that's irrespective of whether the student changes his or her mind. And so I took that as a compliment from Alexander and wanted to underline something for you all, because you're here as students and you're pursuing your education. There's a tendency among universities today, including some of our best universities, for students to decide that there are certain things they don't want to hear, or certain things they shouldn't be expected to hear, and requiring them to hear things with which they disagree is actually an affront. And this is true on both the right and the left. I enjoy reading the New York Times. I have a subscription. I voted for George McGovern in 1972. I'm still proud of that. But I also read the Wall Street Journal, and I don't enjoy reading the Wall Street Journal as much, especially the editorial page, because it's challenging. I hardly ever agree with an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, but it's good for all of us to realize that there are reasonable people who hold different views than we do. And I worry for both liberals and conservatives that social media and other aspects of contemporary society have allowed us to create our own little ideological bubbles in which we can insulate ourselves, and in fact in which we claim an entitlement to insulate ourselves from those who disagree with us. And I think that's a very unfortunate development. So, okay, with that lecture over with now, I will say a few words about RFRA. I've titled my remarks today, Exemptions on Demand. Now, I don't think that's true of all exemptions under RFRA, but I think that the Supreme Court, in its interpretation of this statute, which I still generally support and which I think is an important protection for religious freedom, I think the court has taken a left turn into a cul-de-sac, out of which there aren't any easy exits. So if you, Alexander has mentioned some of these things. Hannah Clayson Smith mentioned them in her really excellent luncheon talk today. But if you're going to make a claim under RFRA, a claim for exemption, you have to allege and prove 3 things. You have to prove, you have to identify a religious act or an exercise, or sometimes even just a belief. And you have to show that you, as the claimant, are sincerely obligated to observe, as a matter of belief, this religious precept, however it's described, as an act or an exercise. And then finally, you have to show that a federal law or some other act of the United States substantially burdens this act or exercise or belief. And then if you prove those 3 things, the burden shifts to the government. And the government is then obligated to show that the burden it's imposing on you is justified. And it does that by proving two things. First, that the goal it's pursuing is exceptionally important, a compelling governmental interest. Now, there's a whole range of things that qualify as a compelling interest, but two classic examples that run through the law are national security, national defense, and the protection of children. Those are interests that are virtually always found to be compelling. And then the government has to show that there is no other way, that is no way to protect these compelling interests other than burdening the religious practice of the claimant. And if the government can prove those two things, then the government will win. So all of that's pretty straightforward and has been the law for quite a while. There is a line of Supreme Court cases which Ms. Smith adverted to at lunch called the religious question cases. And these are questions which hold, I think correctly, that secular courts in the United States, federal or state, are absolutely deprived of the power to make theological judgments. These cases arose during Civil War and Reconstruction. A lot of Protestant churches split during that era over the issue of slavery and then the issue of civil rights for the newly freed slaves. And some of them believed that that racial subordination was divinely ordained by God, and that they did not want to support the new regime. And others of the congregation disagreed. And so then they started fighting about the property and the checking accounts or the assets of the church. And often they would go to a court and say and ask, you need to decide which of us is the true congregation, which of us has been most faithful to the religion, because that would be the entity that's entitled to the church building and the assets and everything else. And the court very consistently since the early 1870s has held that courts lack that power, that the Establishment Clause prohibits them absolutely from deciding these kinds of questions. Now, in the Hobby Lobby case, the Supreme Court seemed to apply the religious question doctrine to the substantial burden element of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. So the court seemed to say this. It seemed to say that courts were prohibited from deciding both whether a federal law burdens religion and whether that burden is substantial. And of course, a claimant has to prove both those things. But if federal courts can't review the allegations of the claimant, then the claimant can basically establish the substantial burden element just by raising his or her hand. You make the allegation, the court says that's not substantial. The claimant says, you can't make that decision. It's my decision as a believer to decide whether or not the burden is substantial. And that's that. What happens next? Well, on the back end, as Alexander talked about, and as Ms. Smith talked about at lunch, there's the compelling interest test, which I just related. A very strict test, in fact called strict scrutiny. And that phrase points to the idea that in certain circumstances, courts have to give a very searching and skeptical examination of government justifications for the laws and the other things that it's doing. So you could always, I suppose, once someone has alleged a substantial burden, and if the court can't review the substantiality or even the existence of that burden, well, you can say, well, no worries. If the government has a really important reason, then it will be able to persuade the court that its law is justified, even though it's a substantial burden on religion. But as the court mentioned several times in Hobby Lobby, as Ms. Smith mentioned today, the compelling interest test, strict scrutiny, is the most challenging standard in constitutional law, the most stringent standard in constitutional law. Governments usually cannot meet that standard. So in other areas of constitutional law, under the Equal Protection Clause, for example, when the government is required to justify a racial classification under strict scrutiny or other kinds of discrimination, it fails more than 80% of the time. Under freedom of speech and other fundamental rights cases, when the government is required to justify a burden on speech, it fails more than 70% of the time. So, 20, 30%, that's not nothing, but 70, 80%, those are big numbers. And that means that we really can't rely on the compelling interest test and strict scrutiny to provide a limiting principle for circumstances in which a claimant wants to be exempt from a religiously neutral and generally applicable law, and courts are unable to review whether, in fact, that person qualifies for that exemption on the basis of one of RFRA's textual requirements, which is that the burden be number one, real, and number two, substantial. So if claims of substantial burden are not reviewable by courts, and if government usually fails to satisfy the compelling interest test, what limiting principle might exist? Well, a number of scholars have suggested sincerity, that really the way to go after this is to go after, is to closely examine the sincerity of the claimant. And again, Ms. Smith this morning, the example she gave to reassure everybody that that RFRA would not be claimed in an excessive number or in unreasonable circumstances. I actually don't agree that this was the case to give that assurance. But she suggested one of the many Church of Marijuana or Church of Opioids, or, people have done this forever, trying to cloak their drug trafficking operations in religion. So, sure, a court can look at that and say, I don't think this is a religion. I think this is a convenient way for you to operate a criminal enterprise, and you're not going to be able to fool us with that. But not all sincerity cases are that easy. In fact, most of them are not easy at all. I think government challenges to sincerity would be bad for religion and bad for believers. First of all, if the government is challenging someone's sincerity, they have to prove that the person doesn't really believe what they say they believe. The government almost never chooses this tactic because it is such a bad look. There is no better way to create sympathy for a religious claimant than to put them on the stand and start cross-examining them on their religious belief like they're before the Spanish Inquisition. You go through all the cases, the government hardly ever challenges sincerity, even in circumstances in which there's a case for it, and I'll mention one of those in a moment. But as I said, I think government challenges are bad for believers and for religion as well. Religious beliefs, I think, almost by definition, are not rational. Think about it. The central claim of Christianity is that a man voluntarily gave up his life and then brought himself back to life. That just doesn't make any sense. There's no rational account of how that could happen, let alone whether it did actually happen with Jesus of Nazareth. And there's so many other examples. The real presence in the Catholic Mass and the host, the Jewish kashrut and the Muslim halal laws, all the miraculous accounts of protection by religion or Mormon temple garments or blessings or things like that. Those are things for which we have no rational account. None of them make any reasonable sense. And this is always what sincerity comes down to. When the government examines sincerity, whether it says this or not, the underlying question always is, could a reasonable person really believe something like this? Now, in a Christian country like ours, that is a country in which the culture is Christian, and most people, the majority, are Christian, we're all familiar with the story of Jesus and the story of the resurrection. Doesn't sound bizarre at all to talk about the resurrection of Jesus, because it's simply familiar. But if we were somewhere else, somewhere in which Christianity were a small minority, then that story would sound bizarre. And things that sound bizarre to us, things we might draw from Islam or from pagan religions, there are places in which those things are entirely normal. Sincerity inquiries prejudice minority religions because their beliefs are unfamiliar and they're less likely to have a veneer of reasonability. But I think sincerity inquiries also prejudice majority and culturally entrenched religions. Now, let me give you the example of a difficult sincerity inquiry, which I think will illustrate the point I'm trying to make. There actually was a very strong basis for challenging sincerity in the Hobby Lobby case. The Green family, the family that still owns all the Hobby Lobby stores, their employee health plan had covered IUDs and morning after pills for years, despite the family's claimed beliefs that these are abortifacients whose use violates their beliefs about taking human life. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal, so not the New York Times, not fake news, but the Wall Street Journal reports that the Green family was completely unaware of this until the Beckett Fund called them up and said, hey, would you like to be a plaintiff in our lawsuit? Because the federal government's going to force you to cover emergency contraception. And they said, yes, we would like to be a plaintiff in that lawsuit. And then, whoops, we're already covering emergency contraception. Okay. So if you're a government lawyer and you want to pull out all the stops on sincerity, I mean, what would you do? So you would ask for a production order. You'd ask Hobby Lobby to produce, or the Green family as the owners of Hobby Lobby, to produce all the evidence, all the documents relating to their use of birth control. Now, this is, of course, a massive intrusion on privacy, and those sorts of things are protected by medical privacy laws. But on the other hand, if you're going to claim that you sincerely believe that emergency contraception use is a violation of your religion and the government is entitled to contest the sincerity of that belief, you can argue that that's a waiver. If you waive that claim, you've waived your medical privacy, and the government is entitled to examine whether or not you live your life consistently with the religious belief that you're arguing. Well, you know, you can see where this would lead. I would not want to see anything like that. And I think, worst of all, I mean, suppose the government did that, and suppose they found that one of the Greens' daughters, one of their teenage daughters, had an IUD, or that at one point they had they had bought emergency contraception. It really misunderstands what religion is all about. I'm a Mormon, and I try to be pretty faithful, but as somebody put Robert Mueller on my life and tried to, examine how well I had lived my entire life according to the precepts of Mormonism, they would find a lot of things, a lot of circumstances in which I fell short. That's what religion, at least what Christianity is about, is we sin and we repent and we try and do better. And I can imagine circumstances in which a family that believes that emergency contraception is an abortifacient and the taking of human life, nevertheless, under the pressure of a crisis, might make a decision to use it, and then later on would think that was wrong. We shouldn't have done that. We knew better. We were taught better. And they consult with their ecclesiastical leaders, they repent, they resolve to do better, and they move on. But, it's easy to prove that they don't really believe emergency contraception, their beliefs about emergency contraception, unless their lives have been consistent in every respect. So the bottom line here, I think, is that if sincerity is the only means of limiting religious exemption claims, the government is, first of all, unlikely to use it. But if it does use it, it would be a serious blow to religious liberty and would force believers to prove that their beliefs are rational and that they observe them with perfect fidelity. And most believers can't prove that, at least can't prove it honestly. I don't think that's a very good place to be doctrinally or politically or culturally. Doctrinally, I don't think anyone can be trusted to be a judge in their own cause, and so it has to be the case that somehow the government should be able to review the existence of substantiality of a burden claim. It can't be the case that you prove substantial burden simply by alleging it. I suppose another alternative would be to water down the compelling interest test to make strict scrutiny something considerably less strict. That's actually a danger that Justice Scalia warned against in Employment Division versus Smith, and that's not a good idea either. I think strict scrutiny needs to mean the same thing no matter when and where it's applied. Let me just, in the remaining few minutes, talk a little more broadly beyond RFRA. I want to talk a little bit about Masterpiece Cake Shop. Alexander mentioned this case. This is a case currently pending before the Supreme Court. It involves state action. It involves the Colorado Civil Rights Act, so RFRA doesn't apply to it, and Colorado doesn't have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And so the believer in that case, the baker, had to make a compelled speech claim. And there's a line of cases where the government says, you're not required. The government can't make you say things. The government can't make you say the Pledge of Allegiance, or it can't make you say under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, for example. So that's his claim. His claim is that he can't make cakes for gay weddings because those constitute his endorsement of the wedding. Now, I know that all of you are not Mormons, or maybe most of you are not Mormons, but this is Utah County, and I expect that you, like me, have been to scores of wedding receptions. Perhaps even during this calendar year, there are so many weddings going on in Utah County, and they all have a cake. And I have to confess, when I see a wedding cake, I don't hear it saying anything. But even if it were saying something, the one thing I'm certain it is not saying is, the baker congratulates the happy couple. The cake is not the speech of the baker. If it's speech at all, it's the speech of the parents or the friends or the couple or whoever paid for the cake. It's not the baker's speech. What the baker is really arguing here is not that he's being forced to speak, but that he's being forced to use his talents and his services and his goods in support of activity of which he disapproves. And if there were a Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Colorado, that's exactly the claim he would make. And I think that's a dangerous claim. I have a 1998 Jeep Cherokee. I love that car, but it's 20 years old and it has 200,000 miles on it, and it breaks down about every 3 months. And my mechanic is a magician. He gets on the internet, he finds parts that no one makes anymore, and he fixes the car. And in most cases, he doesn't even bankrupt me for what he charges. Should he have the right to refuse to serve people because they're Muslim, or they're gay, or they're Mormons, or they're women, or they're feminists, or whatever? Now, maybe if he were a church, in fact, certainly if he were a church, he would be able to do all of those things. I don't know what the Church of Repairing 1998 Jeep Cherokees would look like, but if it were a church, he could do that. But he's a for-profit business in the public square with a presumptive obligation to serve everybody. And I think that's important for all of us. No one should have to live in this country wondering if every time they walk into a store, they're going to be humiliated and refused a good or a service because of who they are. And that's true even if you can go next door and buy the same thing. And in fact, it's the same principle as the one that Alexander mentioned, that the fact that there's some lot across town where you could build your church is not a justification for the city to tell you can't build a church on the lot that you actually own. I think I would call that a notion of equal citizenship, that we're all entitled to circulate in the public areas of our society and fulfill our legitimate and legal wants and needs without fear of being humiliated or rejected. Dignity or offense doesn't quite cover it. I think it's a matter of equal citizenship. Well, I've talked too long and with too much animation as usual, but I thank you for your attention and look forward to your questions.